Deconstruction is a term most famously associated with the French philosopher Jacques Derrida, who actually found it in an archaic dictionary context. It's not something that's easily summarized because it's not really a method, a traditional theory, or a philosophy in the usual sense. Instead, it's more of a response to the idea of singularity, those unique, one-of-a-kind moments or texts that resist simple categorization. Derrida himself described deconstruction as an experience of the impossible, and that's a key phrase. What he meant is that deconstruction confronts the very limits of how we define things, challenging our assumptions about meaning and stability. It's about being as faithful as possible to the unique nature of a text, an author, or an event, without trying to reduce it to a mechanical set of operations or fixed meanings. This experience of the impossible pushes us to see beyond what's obvious and to engage with the singularity of each moment or text in a way that avoids oversimplification. It's a way of respecting complexity and nuance, which ties into the broader theme of our presentation, showing how deconstruction invites us to rethink how we interpret and understand the world around us. So, the theory revolution in American literary criticism is often linked to a pivotal conference held in 1966 called The Languages of Criticism and the Sciences of Man. This event really marked a turning point in how scholars approached literary theory. One of the most influential contributions came from Derrida, with his paper titled Structure, Sign, and Play in the Discourse of the Human Sciences. This paper is widely recognized as the formal beginning of deconstruction in the United States. What Derrida argued was quite significant. He critiqued structuralism by pointing out that the idea of a structure inherently assumes there's a fixed center of meaning, a sort of anchor that holds everything together. But he questioned whether that center is ever truly examined or understood. This critique effectively challenged the foundational assumptions of structuralism. This moment was really important because it signaled a shift away from the more scientific ambitions of structuralism toward a new, more skeptical approach, what we now call post-structuralism. It brought in a tone that was often more playful, questioning, and even anti-heroic, which shaped the direction of literary theory moving forward. So, in essence, this slide captures that critical transition point, what I like to think of as our historical ground zero for this revolutionary shift in thinking about texts and meanings. So, while structuralism aimed to master and categorize systems of signs, deconstruction pushes back against these claims of scientific certainty. Derrida, in particular, argues that structuralists tend to repeat what he calls the metaphysical gesture. That is, the persistent search for basic elements or origins to explain complex phenomena. This approach assumes there's a stable foundation beneath language and meaning, but deconstruction challenges that idea. Structuralism tends to see the subject, our sense of self, as something shaped entirely by pre-existing linguistic structures, which they refer to as long. In contrast, deconstruction views the subject as something inherently unstable, always in flux, always in process. It suggests there's no fixed core or ultimate foundation of identity. It's also important to note that it's a simplification to think of deconstruction as simply coming after structuralism. Derrida's critiques were actually present from his earliest work, indicating that deconstruction isn't just a reaction, but a fundamentally different way of thinking about language and meaning. As we move beyond structuralism, these ideas help us understand how Derrida's thinking complicates traditional notions of stability and certainty in language. Derrida identifies Western thought as logocentric, meaning it's centered around the idea of a final word, presence, or truth, that acts as the ultimate anchor for meaning. Now, logocentrism assumes that this kind of meaning is a full presence, something that exists prior to and independently of language itself. Throughout history, thinkers have proposed various candidates for this, transcendental signified, such as God, the self, matter, or even reason. These are seen as ultimate foundations that give stability to our understanding of the world. But here, where deconstruction comes into play, it reveals that these supposed centers are actually fictions. They're constructs created to stop the endless play of signification. In other words, They provide a false sense of security, a supposed final meaning that actually masks the fluid and unstable nature of meaning itself. So, the critique of logocentrism is really about questioning these assumed ultimate points and understanding that meaning is always in flux, never fully fixed. This ties into our broader theme of how language and interpretation shape our perception of reality. Let's talk about a key feature of logocentrism, which is phonocentrism. This is essentially the traditional preference for speech over writing. Historically, Western philosophy has often seen speech as being closer to the original thought, or what we might call presence. In contrast, writing has been viewed as secondary, derivative, and even contaminated, because it is considered a transcript that comes after the fact. From Plato all the way to Rousseau, writing was often dismissed as a disease of speech, because it functions in the absence of the speaker. This means that writing is seen as something that lacks the immediacy of spoken words, which are tied directly to the speaker's voice and presence. But Derrida challenges this idea. He shows us that speech itself shares many features we usually associate with writing, such as absence and repeatability. So, the distinction between speech and writing becomes less clear-cut than we might have thought. This idea of phonocentrism and the privilege of speech fits into the broader theme of how we prioritize certain forms of communication over others, shaping our understanding of reality and presence in philosophy. So, here we see that deconstruction really broadens our understanding of writing. It's no longer just about ink on paper, but about a general structure of communication that can take many forms. The key idea here is iterability. That's the essential quality of any sign. It means that a sign can be repeated across different contexts and used for different purposes. For a message to truly function as a message, it has to be able to stand on its own, even when the original sender is no longer present or the original context has shifted. This is what makes signs so powerful. They are not tied to a single moment or meaning. Because every sign is iterable, it's never quite itself in a fixed way. Its meaning is always open to reinterpretation, and it can never be fully exhausted or pinned down. This idea of redefining, writing, and emphasizing iterability helps us understand communication as something dynamic, fluid, and infinitely adaptable, core themes that run throughout this presentation. Derrida introduced the term difference to illustrate the complex, divided nature of the sign. In French, you see, the in difference isn't actually heard when spoken, which means the meaning of the word becomes clear only in writing. This is a deliberate move to challenge phonocentrism, or the idea that speech is more fundamental than writing. The term itself is quite clever because it combines two ideas: to differ, meaning something spatial and different from something else, and to defer, which refers to a temporal delay. Essentially, meaning isn't something fixed. It's produced through a system of differences between signs, and importantly, this meaning is always deferred. It's postponed along a chain of signifiers, that is, words and signs referring to other signs, never reaching a final, absolute meaning. So difference captures this dual sense, both differa to differ and differa to defer, and highlights how meaning is a continuous, shifting process rather than something static. This idea ties into our overall theme of understanding language as an unstable, dynamic system. So when we look at Western metaphysics, we see it often depends on binary oppositions, like speech versus writing, nature versus culture, mind versus body, or male versus female. These pairings seem straightforward at first, but Derrida challenges that idea. He argues that these are not neutral or equal pairs. In fact, he calls them violent hierarchies. That means one term is privileged over the other, often in a way that reinforces power or dominance. Deconstruction, then, begins by flipping these hierarchies. For example, instead of thinking of speech as primary and writing as secondary, Derrida shows that speech is actually a form of writing. This inversion helps us see that the original hierarchy was not natural or fixed, but constructed. But deconstruction doesn't stop there. It resists setting up a new hierarchy in its place. Instead, it reveals that both terms depend on a prior excess, something outside of or beyond the binary, that resists settling into a final, fixed meaning. This idea of excess helps us understand that meaning is always deferred, never fully complete or stable. Overall, this process of exposing violent hierarchies and then inverting them is central to deconstruction. It really challenges us to rethink how we organize and privilege concepts, showing that these oppositions are more fragile and interdependent than they might seem. This connects to the larger theme of questioning assumptions and revealing the complexity behind seemingly simple dichotomies. So here, Derrida introduces the concept of the supplement to describe the complex and often unstable relationship between privileged and marginalized terms. Essentially, a supplement does two things. It adds to something, but it also substitutes for it. This dual role makes things quite fluid and somewhat unpredictable. For example, Rousseau saw writing as a supplement to speech, something that enhances or supports spoken language. But deconstruction challenges that idea, showing us that speech actually only needs supplementation because it was never truly self-sufficient from the start. Speech, in a way, relies on these supplements to fully come into being. Ultimately, what we think of as the original is actually produced through a series of supplements or copies that follow it. So, the idea of an original isn't as stable as we might believe. It's shaped and defined by these subsequent layers of supplementation. This brings us to the core of the logic of the supplement, highlighting how the supposed purity or primacy of certain terms or concepts is often an illusion created by these very supplements. It's a reminder that what we consider foundational or authentic is always intertwined with these supplementary layers. This famous but often misunderstood statement is frequently translated as there is nothing outside the text. But it's important to clarify what Derrida really means. He's not denying the existence of physical reality. Instead, he's arguing that it's impossible to categorically distinguish what is inside or outside a text. Experience, in his view, is always mediated by signs, words, symbols, and interpretations. Whenever we think we've reached reality itself, we discover more chains of supplements and interpretations that shape our understanding. This leads to the key idea that reality is always already textual. That is, any event, like a word or a moment, must be isolated and interpreted within various contexts. Nothing exists outside of these interpretive frameworks. So the notion of no outside of text means there is no pure, unmediated access to reality. Everything is embedded within language and signs. This challenges us to see reality not as something separate from texts, but as fundamentally intertwined with interpretation and meaning. So, here we see that iterability involves what Derrida calls destinerance, which is essentially the inherent possibility that a message can go astray or err. Now, this might sound like a flaw, but it's actually fundamental to how communication works. If a letter, for example, can potentially not reach its destination, that very structural possibility of misunderstanding is what makes communication possible in the first place. Misunderstanding isn't just a failure or an accident, it's actually a necessary part of the process. Without the risk that a message might be lost or misread, communication would simply not exist at all. It's this very risk that keeps the whole system alive and meaningful. So, in essence, the risk of communication, the potential for messages to go astray is not a bug but a feature. It's what allows language and interaction to be dynamic, flexible, and truly human. Let's talk about deconstructive reading and what makes it unique. It focuses on these so-called symptomatic points within a text, moments where the usual logic or meaning starts to break down. Think of these points as cracks in the surface of the text, revealing underlying tensions. These moments are called aporias, which are basically impasses of meaning. An aporia is like an undecidable oscillation, where the text's rhetorical strategies undermine its own arguments. It's as if the text contains contradictions that can't be easily resolved. What deconstruction reveals is that every system, whether it's a text, a philosophy, or an ideology, has these elements within it. These elements threaten to undo the coherence of the system, but are often suppressed to keep everything stable on the surface. So, in a way, deconstruction shows us that no system is ever completely stable. it's always vulnerable to these internal contradictions. And that's where the idea of aporia, or the impasse of meaning, comes in. It's this persistent tension, this undecidable point, that exposes the limitations of any system's supposed coherence. By highlighting these impasses, deconstruction helps us see how meaning is never fixed but always in flux, always susceptible to these internal contradictions. This ties back to our overall theme, how meaning is constructed and deconstructed, revealing the instability beneath seemingly solid structures. Deconstruction is often misunderstood as being nihilistic or purely destructive of truth and reason, but Derrida emphasized that it's actually an affirmative process. It's not about dismissing concepts entirely, but rather about stripping them of their usual authority to do something different, something more nuanced. The key idea here is that what we often call truth isn't just a simple, self-evident fact. Instead, it's constructed through metaphors and assumptions that we might not even be aware of. The real nihilism, in this context, is pretending that truth is just true, without recognizing how it's built or the metaphors it relies on. So, deconstruction invites us to rebuild our intellectual structures, our frameworks of understanding, in a way that makes us never take them for granted again. It's about fostering a more active engagement with ideas, about understanding that our dwelling in these concepts is always something we can reshape and question. This idea of affirmation versus nihilism is central to the overall theme. Deconstruction isn't about tearing down for the sake of chaos. It's about affirming the possibility of a more conscious, reflective relationship with truth and meaning. So, the Yale School, active roughly between 1975 and 1985, was really more of a loose alliance than a formal group. They took Derrida's ideas and adapted them specifically for American literary studies, making his complex theories more accessible and applicable in a new context. Core members of this movement included influential figures like Paul de Man, Jeffrey Hartman, and J. Hillies Miller. Harold Bloom was connected to them, but more on the periphery. Their key publication, Deconstruction and Criticism, published in 1979, was quite groundbreaking. It showed how these deconstructive theories could lead to radical rereadings of the literary canon, challenging traditional interpretations and opening up new ways of understanding texts. However, critics like Terry Eagleton argued that this movement sometimes overreached. He believed it could swallow up history in what he called an expanded empire of undecidable textuality, meaning that by focusing so much on the instability of texts, they risked neglecting historical context and meaning altogether. Overall, the Yale School played a major role in shaping post-structuralist approaches in American literary studies, but their work also sparked important debates about the limits of deconstruction and its implications for understanding literature and history. Paul de Man was truly the linchpin of the Yale School, and he had a distinctive way of viewing language. He saw it as fundamentally rhetorical and figurative, meaning that language is always playing with meaning, never straightforward. His idea of blindness and insight is particularly fascinating. He argued that critics only really gain insight through a method or a theory, but this is always something they have to eventually contradict or move beyond. For de Man, all reading is necessarily misreading because tropes, those figurative devices, inevitably intervene between the critic and the text. That means our understanding is always mediated, never completely transparent. He famously stated that the allegory of reading narrates the impossibility of reading, which captures this idea perfectly. So, when we talk about blindness and insight, we're touching on how our interpretations are always provisional, always subject to revision. It's a reminder that the act of reading itself is inherently complex and, in a sense, impossible to fully master. This ties into the larger theme of the presentation, the complicated, layered nature of language and interpretation. Let's talk about J. Hillies Miller and his defense of deconstruction. He's known for challenging the idea that deconstruction relies solely on vague or univocal readings that are somehow parasitic on straightforward, obvious interpretations. In his essay, The Critic as Host, he presents a fascinating analogy. He suggests that the obvious reading and the deconstructive reading are actually inseparable, much like a host and a parasite. They're interconnected parts of the same process. This means that any act of reading isn't just about finding one meaning, but about practicing both the construing of plain grammar, which is the literal or surface meaning, and the interpretation of figures, which involves recognizing figurative language and deeper implications. These two aspects are not separate or competing, but are mutually necessary. Hillies Miller emphasizes that realistic fiction, which might seem straightforward on the surface, is always open to figurative readings. These figurative interpretations can reveal how the text is self-deconstructing, showing us its own internal contradictions or complexities. So the key takeaway here is that deconstruction isn't about dismissing the obvious. It's about understanding how both the plain and the figurative coexist and inform each other. This idea ties into our larger theme. That meaning is layered and dynamic, and that good reading involves engaging with these multiple levels simultaneously. Deconstruction challenges the idea that there is a strict divide between what we call literary and philosophical writing. Instead, it sees literarity not as an inherent property of a text, but as something socially constructed, a kind of coded space where certain metaphysical readings are put on hold. Literature, in this sense, is especially interesting because it often displays the very instabilities and metaphors that philosophy tends to try to hide or clarify. Think about experimental texts, like those by James Joyce. These texts are valued because they reveal how language actually organizes our understanding of the world, rather than just trying to mirror it accurately. So, in a broader way, deconstruction shows us that the boundaries between literature and philosophy are more fluid than we might think. Both are ways of engaging with meaning, language, and truth, often overlapping and intertwining. This perspective helps us understand how literary texts can serve as a kind of philosophical inquiry, exposing the assumptions and limitations of our usual ways of thinking. So, in his later work, Derrida shifted more openly toward themes of ethics and politics, especially in his book Spectres of Marx from 1993. What's really interesting is that he argued deconstruction, which we've discussed earlier, wouldn't have been possible without the tradition of Marxism. In fact, he sees deconstruction as something that seeks to radicalize Marxist ideas. What this means is that deconstruction reveals justice as an excessive force, something that disturbs settled authority and opens up the space for continuous change. It's like justice is not a fixed point, but a dynamic, disruptive force. When we look at its political implications, Derrida's approach can be described as anarchist, in the sense that it thinks without a transcendental point of origin or a final law, meaning it's always open to new possibilities and doesn't rely on a fixed, ultimate authority. So overall, this slide highlights how Derrida's work connects ethics and politics by emphasizing justice as an ongoing, disruptive force, and by advocating for a form of politics that is open-ended and non-hierarchical. This ties back to our broader theme of questioning established structures and thinking beyond traditional boundaries. Derrida introduced the concept of hauntology, which is really about the idea of a foreign body or a ghost that continues to inhabit a text or culture. It's like an unseen presence that influences and disrupts our understanding of the past and the present. This idea sparked what's called a spectral turn in criticism, where scholars started to see texts as sites where the past, what Derrida called revenants, returns to challenge the present. This shift also influenced the Yale School's focus, which moved from just questioning the limits of knowledge to exploring trauma theory. Trauma, in this context, is understood as a kind of literality, meaning it's a truth that history can't fully process or integrate. Because of that, trauma demands a new way of ethical testimony and responsibility, one that recognizes the persistent, haunting presence of these unresolved wounds. So the spectral turn and trauma theory together encourage us to think about history and texts not just as fixed stories, but as dynamic, haunted spaces where the unresolved continues to resonate and shape our understanding today. It's a powerful reminder that the past isn't truly gone. It's always lingering, influencing the present in profound ways. So, in the late 1980s, we saw a decline in the popularity of deconstruction, and one of the reasons was the Paul de Man affair. This was a scandal involving his wartime writings, which raised questions about his integrity and, by extension, cast a shadow over the movement. Even though the number of active, card-carrying deconstructionists has decreased, the influence of deconstruction remains significant and far-reaching. It's not just about a school of thought, it's about how it opened doors for other critical approaches. For example, deconstruction helped pave the way for modern fields like post-colonialism, queer theory, and eco-criticism, areas that continue to challenge and expand our understanding of culture, identity, and the environment. Ultimately, deconstruction teaches us that critical vigilance is an ongoing, permanent task. It's about constantly questioning the ground beneath our feet, that foundation we rely on, because, as we try to secure it, we might realize it's more unstable than we thought. So, even if deconstruction is less in the spotlight today, its legacy urges us to stay alert, questioning assumptions and meanings as part of our continuous critical practice.